I remember driving up that winding mountain road, the kind where the trees lean close enough that their shadows seem to touch your car before you do. I'd booked the cabin thinking it would be a quiet escape, a place to breathe away from the city's clatter. The listing made it sound idyllic, rustic charm, seclusion, a porch where you could watch the sun set behind the ridges. But as soon as I turned off the paved road and onto the dirt track, something about the air changed. It was thicker, heavier, like it carried its own weight, and the deeper I drove, the more the quiet pressed in, filling the car with a silence so profound it almost felt physical. When I finally saw the cabin, half hidden behind pines, it looked exactly like the photos, though more worn, more alive somehow. The first night was disorienting. The kind of quiet there isn't peaceful. It's an awareness of absence. No wind stirred the needles on the ground. No birds called in the distance. I tried reading, tried convincing myself it was just the mountain hush, but the silence felt like someone was watching, listening. At dusk, I thought I heard it, a scraping, soft and intermittent against the cabin side. I froze, convinced it was a branch or a raccoon, but the rhythm didn't match the tree's sway. I crept to the window, pulling aside the curtain slowly, heart hammering, and saw nothing. Just the shadows of the trees twisting in the dying light. I laughed at myself, muttering about nerves and the romanticized idea of seclusion. By the third night, the quiet had grown heavier, almost tangible. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by creaks from the floorboards. Soft, deliberate, circling the room as if someone was pacing just beyond my vision. I'd roll over, telling myself it was the house settling, the old wood contracting, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The steps didn't follow the patterns of a building. They were too precise, too intentional. One night, I woke to the smell first. A faint copper scent, metallic, so subtle I almost convinced myself it was imagination. Then I saw it, a figure standing on the porch, perfectly still, head slightly tilted, staring straight at me. I couldn't tell if it was human. There was no detail, no features, just a dark silhouette against the mist. My skin prickled, goosebumps rising, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt truly exposed. I tried to leave in the morning. I really did. But the narrow road I'd taken up was blocked, a massive tree laying across the path that hadn't been there the night before. I parked, stepped out and circled it, trying to find a way around. Nothing. The forest seemed to lean in closer, branches clawing at my jacket as though warning me off. My phone had no signal, and the silence now felt predatory, like the woods themselves had turned against me. I went back to the cabin, thinking at least I had shelter, though each shadow inside felt alive, each creak a whispered warning. Night after night, the same pattern. The footsteps circling. The smell of iron in the air. The occasional glimpse of that figure on the porch, always still, always watching. I stopped opening the curtains. I stopped checking the windows. I tried to pretend it was just my mind, fraying under isolation, but the feeling persisted. I wasn't alone, and I knew it. I could feel it in the walls, in the floor beneath me, even when I pulled the covers over my head. Once, in a rare surge of courage, I stepped outside to confront it, or at least to see if I could. The fog hung thick, curling around my ankles and moving with a life of its own. The figure wasn't there, yet the hair on my neck stood on end as though it were still watching, just out of reach. I called out, voice shaking, but only the wind responded, whispering through the pines. When I went back inside, I found new scratches on the porch boards, long, thin, deliberate, fresh enough to have been made while I was standing in the yard. My stomach turned, and I sat there in the dark, too scared to sleep, too exhausted to leave. The days blended together, and I started noticing other things. Shadows moving in patterns that made no sense, fleeting glimpses of shapes in the corner of my vision that disappeared when I turned my head. I stopped leaving the cabin entirely during daylight, afraid that if I stepped into the hollow I'd vanish, or worse, the figure would meet me there. I began to talk to myself, narrating my movements, trying to remind myself I was still in control, still human. But every creak, every scrape, every whisper of movement seemed to answer me back. By the last night, I realized the cabin itself had become part of the hollow's rhythm. The walls, the floor, the very air seemed to lean in, breathing along with me, mimicking me, and the figure, if it had ever been just one, was everywhere at once. I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor, pressed against the corner, listening to the creaks circle the room again and again, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. When dawn finally broke, I packed quickly, my hands shaking, and fled down the mountain road. Even now, months later, I can't shake it. Sometimes I smell copper in the air, faint and distant, and for a moment, I swear I feel those circling steps. I've told people what happened, but they just smile politely, dismissing it as stress or imagination. I know better. I've never gone back, and I doubt I ever will. But the hollow remembers. It always remembers. The trees, the fog, the scraping. It's all still there in my mind. And some nights, when the wind howls just right, I can almost see that figure on the porch, watching, waiting, patient as the hollow itself. I didn't expect much when I booked the Airbnb. From the photos, it seemed quaint enough. A peeling white two-story house tucked on the edge of a small Appalachian town, with a wide porch and chipped shutters that gave it a certain rustic charm. The host was pleasant, smiling and polite, though there was an edge to him when I asked about the house's history. He said it had been in the family for generations, nothing unusual, though when I pressed further, he shrugged and said, "Old houses carry their own memories, that's all." I nodded, trying to seem unconcerned, though a flicker of unease settled in my chest. The first night in the third-floor bedroom, everything seemed normal enough. The bed was comfortable, the sheets faintly smelling of mothballs, the air thick with the scent of aged wood. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and hesitant, almost apologetic. I froze, thinking maybe it was the wind seeping through the cracks in the window frame. But it wasn't wind, not exactly. It was deliberate, like a voice testing the edges of its own courage before speaking. I strained to hear, heart racing, and the whispering stopped. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the house settling, and tried to sleep. By the second night, the whispers had grown bolder. They weren't just soft sounds at the edge of hearing. They had direction, coming from the corner near the window, drifting toward the head of the bed. I could almost make out syllables, fragments of words I couldn't piece together. I tried leaving the door cracked open, thinking maybe the sound was trapped in a room somehow, but it didn't help. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to shadows shift across the walls, moving in ways that made no sense. Sometimes the patterns looked like someone pacing behind me, just beyond sight, though whenever I turned, there was nothing but the familiar cracked wallpaper and the dim glow of moonlight. Then, the night the whispers spoke my name, I realized I was in serious trouble. At first, it was so low I thought I had imagined it. My name, uttered slowly, in a gravelly tone that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. I called out, but my voice seemed swallowed by the walls, absorbed before it could reach anywhere. I tried to leave the room, moving toward the door, but something held me back, some heavy, suffocating presence pressing down. I felt it in the floor beneath my feet, in the air that clung to my skin, in the shadows that crept impossibly long across the floorboards. Morning brought no relief. On the floor around the bed were scratches, thin, jagged, forming a crude circle. I had slept there alone, or at least I thought I had. I checked the rest of the house, every closet, every hallway, even under the beds. Nothing, not a sign of anyone else. It didn't make sense, yet the scratches were real, and the memory of my name, whispered in the dark, lingered like a warning. Over the next few days, I began noticing little things. Objects were slightly out of place when I returned to the room. Books moved a few inches, a chair shifted ever so slightly. The whispering continued, sometimes apologetic, sometimes urgent. One evening, I woke to a low chant, incomprehensible, circling the room. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, trying to call the host, but there was no signal. That night, sleep became impossible. I sat upright in bed, listening as the room itself seemed to breathe around me, as if the walls were alive, inhaling and exhaling with me. On the third night, the presence grew bolder. Shadows no longer stayed on the walls. They stretched toward me, moving in ways that defied logic, creeping over the floor, lingering at the corners of my vision. I tried recording, capturing any evidence, but the playback revealed only static and silence. It was like the room erased itself from technology, a private theater of terror meant only for me. I began to wonder if it had been here long before I arrived, if it had known I would come, had prepared this house to greet me in the only way it knew how, whispers, scratches, and a nameless weight pressing from the dark. By the last night I was no longer afraid of leaving. I was afraid of staying, of the thought that I might walk into something I couldn't comprehend. The whispers followed me even as I packed hastily, as if warning me not to go, not to forget. I opened the front door and stepped into the cool night air, expecting relief, but the stillness of the town outside felt just as heavy as the house, as though the whispers had stretched their reach beyond the walls. I glanced back at the peeling white paint and the darkened windows, and I could swear one of the shadows lingered in the upstairs window, waiting, watching. Even now, I can't shake it. Sometimes in my apartment, I think I hear the soft, hesitant whisper of my name. Sometimes I see a shadow flit across the corner of my eye, indistinct but deliberate. I've told friends, family, strangers even, but no one can understand what it feels like to be followed by a voice that shouldn't exist, in a place that should have been safe. I don't know if it was a person or something older, something tied to the house, the town, the mountains themselves. I only know that room 3 still exists, still waits, and the moment I let my guard down, I might hear it calling me again. I booked the place because it was cheap, quiet, and tucked outside a small Appalachian town with a mountains crowd close enough to make you feel like you're driving into someone's memory. The listing mentioned the attic as quaint storage space. Nothing special, just an old part of the house that the host apparently kept for odds and ends. I didn't think much about it at first. The house itself was simple. Old floorboards, sagging beams, that dusty smell older mountain homes all seem to share. But from the moment I stepped inside, I felt something above me. A weight. Not threatening exactly, but aware. As if that attic, hidden just overhead, took note of me the second I crossed the threshold. The first night was uneventful enough. I ate, unpacked, tried to unwind, but every so often I'd catch myself glancing at the ceiling, tracing the faint outline of the attic door. It had a square metal latch, old and scratched, with a key the host had left, just in case you ever need it, though you probably won't. He laughed when he said that, but it hadn't sounded natural. More like he was covering something. Still, I locked the attic before bed. Not out of fear, just habit. Or that's what I told myself. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up without knowing why. No noise, no movement, just that sudden awareness that drags you from sleep. The house was dead quiet. Until I noticed the tiniest draft brushing against my arms. I sat up, confused. The window was shut tight. Then I saw it, the attic door hanging open by an inch or two, its shadow stretching across the ceiling like a hand reaching down. I stared at it for maybe a full minute before I worked up the courage to get out of bed and close it again. When I grabbed the latch, it felt cold, almost damp, as if someone had held it moments before. I locked it, checked it twice, and forced myself back to sleep. The next night, the smell hit me. Faint at first, rotten, metallic and old, mixed with dust that tasted dry on my tongue. I followed it without thinking, like something pulling me upward. The attic door was unlocked again, cracked open just enough for a sliver of pale moonlight to spill down the ladder. The smell grew stronger as I climbed, my hand shaking on the banister. When I pushed the door open fully, I saw dust floating in thick beams of cold light, swirling like something had just moved through it. At the center of the room sat an old rocking chair. Nothing unusual about that. Old mountain homes have them everywhere, but this one was moving. Slow. Deliberate. As if someone still sat in it, still rocking, still waiting. I stood there in the half-dark, watching it creak back and forth. My mind tried to rationalize. Drafts, foundation settling, some stupid mechanic of old furniture. But the air was still. Heavy. Dead. I stepped back and closed the door, but when I reached the bottom of the ladder, I heard it. The faintest exhale, soft and shallow, drifting from behind the door I had just shut. Not mine. Not in rhythm with mine. Something breathing when I wasn't. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time I drifted off, I felt like someone was kneeling beside the bed, leaning in close enough for their breath to skim my skin. When I'd shoot upright, the room would be still, but I could sense something above me, listening, mimicking. The house had a way of adjusting itself to your presence, like it was relearning how to be lived in. The steps creaked where I hadn't walked, the walls settled where I hadn't touched. And always, that attic door seemed to open as soon as I turned my back. I avoided the attic entirely after that. I kept the door locked, shoved a chair beneath it even though I wasn't sure that would do anything. I tried reading, talking on the phone, anything to drown out the quiet that pressed in on me, but every sound I made seemed to echo upward, as though something was listening carefully, matching the rhythm of my breaths, timing each inhale and exhale until I couldn't tell where mine ended and the other began. Then came the last morning. I woke before sunrise, a dull gray light creeping through the blinds. For once, the attic door was closed. Still latched. Nothing moved. The air was strangely calm, as if whatever had been watching me all week had finally stepped back, or maybe had gotten what it wanted. A part of me wanted to leave immediately, but something made me go up there one last time. Maybe curiosity. Maybe stupidity. Maybe the quiet itself pulling me forward. When I pushed the attic door open, the smell was gone. Everything was still. Dust drifted lazily, untouched. The rocking chair didn't move. I almost convinced myself I'd made it all up, that stress and isolation had taken small things and turned them into something monstrous. But then I saw it on the far wall, drawn in uneven childish strokes, as if by a crayon dragged too hard. A figure. Stick-thin. Wrong proportions. And the eyes. Just two empty circles scratched over and over until the wood beneath was gouged raw. The figure stood alone, facing outward. Facing me. I stared at it far too long. Something about it felt familiar, like it had been there long before I arrived, waiting for someone to notice. The hollow eyes followed me even after I backed down the ladder, even after I shut the door, even after I grabbed my bag and walked out of that house without looking back. I haven't been able to shake the feeling since. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment settles and the air goes still, I hear a breath behind my own. Soft. Shallow. Timed just slightly wrong. And every now and then, a memory flickers. The rocking chair, the cold latch, that childish drawing carved too deep. I tell myself it was just an old house with old noises. Just my imagination in a quiet place far from home. But deep down, I know something was up there. Something that listened closely. Something that learned my breath, my footsteps, my presence. And something that might not have stayed behind when I left. I didn't expect the house to feel like it was breathing the moment I walked in. The Airbnb looked ordinary from the outside. A small, weathered building in the middle of a quiet Appalachian town. Paint peeled from the siding, the porch sagged, and the steps creaked beneath each of my cautious footsteps. The host was pleasant enough, though he had that nervous smile people get when they know more than they're willing to say. He showed me the hallway right away. A long, narrow stretch lined with pictures of guests from years past. Faces frozen in time, smiling, waving, unaware. I remember thinking it was charming in that old house kind of way, and it gave the hallway a strange sense of history. The first night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I kept the lights on though, because it had that oppressive kind of stillness where shadows don't behave the way they should. Then, late around midnight, I heard it, a slow, deliberate set of footsteps above me. At first, I laughed nervously, telling myself it must be some old floorboard shifting, settling, maybe the attic. But the house was only one story. I froze in bed, straining to hear, but the footsteps stopped as soon as I turned my head. My pulse raced. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks, and eventually I drifted into fitful sleep. The next evening, the pacing returned. This time it circled, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hall. I got up trying to trace it, thinking maybe someone else was there. But when I inspected every corner, every closet, every room, the house was empty. That's when I noticed something else. The pictures. Faces subtly shifting. Not in any natural way. Just the hint of a glance here, the tilt of a head there. A smile that wasn't there before seemed to stretch just slightly. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was the shadows, the angle of the light from the hallway lamp. But deep down I felt eyes on me, old eyes in frames that weren't quite the same. By the third night, the sound of footsteps had grown heavier, faster, pounding as if someone, or something, was running down the hall, the floorboards groaning under an invisible weight. I couldn't sleep. I pulled the covers over my head, closed my eyes, and tried to ignore the rhythmic pounding that seemed to circle the bedroom, echoing off walls in impossible ways. When I peeked out, the hallway was empty, silent again, but the shadows seemed thicker, lingering in the corners longer than they should. Each time I turned a corner, I felt the house itself leaning in, stretching toward me, following my movements. The pictures began to disturb me more than the footsteps. I would catch glimpses of faces, frozen in the frames, tilting slightly, eyes following me down the hall. I could swear one morning that the smiling couple in a faded photograph had shifted. He looked almost accusatory, she terrified. I told myself it was impossible. Yet every time I walked past, something seemed wrong. The more I noticed, the more aware I became of the rhythm of the house, the way it creaked and groaned not under weight but in response to my presence. On the fourth night, I decided I had to leave. But the moment I stood in the hallway, ready to grab my bag, I heard the footsteps pounding faster than ever, circling, chasing, closing in. I ran toward the front door, heart hammering, and every step I took echoed behind me, as if something invisible was keeping perfect pace. The shadows in the hallway stretched unnaturally long, curling toward me like black smoke, almost tangible. I flung open the door, bolted down the steps, and didn't stop until I reached the street. When I looked back, the house sat quietly as though it had never moved, never breathed, never watched. I didn't return, but I still think about that hallway. The way the shadows lingered, the way the floorboards groaned with life that shouldn't exist, the way the faces in the pictures seemed aware. I've told people about it, but they just smile politely, thinking I'm exaggerating or imagining things. I know the truth. That house wasn't empty. It's alive in its own way, feeding on anyone who steps inside, learning their movements, echoing their fear, holding their attention until they can't distinguish reality from the rhythm of the footsteps. I can still hear them sometimes, late at night, when the wind outside my apartment rattles the windows. I swear the hallways are calling, pacing for me, waiting for me to return. I didn't think much of the window when I first checked into the Airbnb. It stretched nearly the full length of the wall, framing the Appalachian Mountains like a painting. Layers of dark ridges fading into the horizon. The whole valley dipped in that bluish haze the locals say never really lifts. The host had listed the view as the property's main selling point, and I'll admit, it was beautiful in a quiet, lonely way. The kind of view that makes you forget how far you are from the nearest neighbor, or how the woods around you can swallow sound so completely you start imagining things breathing just beyond the tree line. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the couch and watched the mountains turn from blue to gray to pitch black, the window reflecting the room behind me as the last bit of daylight drained away. It wasn't until I stood up that I noticed something strange. My reflection moved a half second after I did, like it had to think about it first. I chalked it up to exhaustion from traveling and went to bed, though I remember lying there listening to the wind scrape branches against the siding, wondering why the delay in the glass bothered me so much. The next evening, I cooked dinner and sat in front of the window again. The reflection felt off, like I wasn't alone in the room. My reflection's shoulders seemed slightly lowered, or maybe its head was turned a fraction more than mine. Tiny differences. Easy to ignore. But the longer I stared at it, the more I felt a cold prickle crawl slowly up my spine. I got up to check the window, convincing myself the glass was just warped. But when I pressed my hand against the pane, my reflection didn't immediately follow. It hovered there a breath behind. A delay. A choice. I stepped back fast, heart pounding. I remembered telling myself not to jump to conclusions. Old houses have quirks, and maybe the glass was double-paned or uneven. I didn't want to call the host and sound paranoid. I kept the curtains closed the rest of the night, though I could feel that window behind me like an open mouth. A presence. Watching. On the third night, I made the mistake of looking outside after dark. The moon was faint, barely there, and the mountains blended with the sky. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. A silhouette. Tall, unmoving, facing the house. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or a shadow, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became. Someone was standing out there, watching me. My first thought was that a hiker had gotten lost. My second thought, the one that chilled me, was that they weren't lost at all. That they had been there. Waiting. I called the host immediately, trying to keep my voice steady. He sounded confused, almost insulted, insisting no one could be near the property without a key. The land was fenced, gated. The only road in ran right past his house, and he hadn't seen anyone come through. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me, watching that silhouette stand perfectly still. Every time I blinked, I feared it would be closer. But it never moved. Not until dawn broke gently across the mountains. When the light hit the treetops, the figure dissolved like it had never been there at all. The next night it came back. This time it stood closer to the house, halfway between the trees and the window. I could see more detail now. The shape was still too dark to make out a face, but the posture was unmistakable. Head tilted slightly, hands at its sides, staring straight at me. I turned away at one point, pretending to ignore it, but the weight of its gaze pressed on my back like a hand. I could feel something in me tightening with every passing minute, like my body knew more than my mind was ready to admit. When I looked again, it hadn't moved, but I swear its outline was sharper, nearer, more intent. By the fifth night, I was barely holding myself together. Every time I passed that window, even during the day, I felt watched. The reflections were wrong again too. Not delayed anymore. Just off. My reflection's eyes looked slightly higher than mine. Its lips parted just a little when mine weren't. I tried recording it on my phone, but the moment I hit record, everything snapped back to normal. Nothing misaligned. Nothing delayed. Just my reflection. Or something pretending to be. That night, I didn't plan on sleeping. I sat with my back to the wall, phone in hand, watching the window from the corner of my eye. The silhouette was already there, close enough now that its outline pressed against the faint shine of the glass. It wasn't outside anymore. It was right at the window, staring in. The room felt colder. The kind of cold that sank inward, deeper than skin. I couldn't see a face, but I felt its eyes on me, purposeful and direct. Hours passed this way. I didn't blink much. Didn't breathe much either. I just sat there, shaking, waiting for dawn because somehow I'd convinced myself dawn meant safety. When the first bit of light finally crept over the mountains, the figure vanished again. Just gone. Like a switch had been flipped. That morning, I packed my bags. I didn't care if the host thought I was crazy. But as I zipped the last suitcase shut, I hesitated. The window was cracked open. Just an inch. I don't remember opening it. I don't remember touching it. But something told me to leave it that way. A strange compulsion. Maybe if I didn't fight it, if I gave that thing what it wanted, it would leave me alone. I left the window cracked. I left the curtains open too. When I walked out, I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if something was standing on the other side of that glass, watching me leave. That was months ago. I'm home now, back in a place full of people and noise, but sometimes I still feel it. That prickle at the back of my neck. That sense of eyes lingering on me longer than they should. I avoid windows now. Reflections too. Especially at night. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see a silhouette in the glass, still as a photograph, waiting for me to turn my head. Waiting for me to recognize it. Waiting for me to come back. The house didn't feel strange when I first walked in. If anything, it felt cleaner than most Airbnbs I'd stayed in. Fresh sheets, folded towels, a faint lemon scent lingering in the hallway. It sat at the edge of a quiet Appalachian town, tucked between two small hills that made the place feel more secluded than the listing let on. The host had left the lights on for me and a note on the counter that said, "Welcome. Make yourself at home." Nothing about it felt threatening. Just quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but I tried to ignore that. After all, people booked places like this specifically for the peace. The first night, I fell asleep quickly. I'd been on the road for hours, and my body felt heavy, exhausted. Sometime after midnight, a soft knocking woke me. It sounded like someone tapping a knuckle gently against wood. Hesitant, almost polite. I thought maybe it was the heat settling in the walls or a branch hitting the siding, but the sound was too rhythmic, and it was coming from inside the house. I sat up, listening. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 2 more. I couldn't tell where it came from at first. The sound seemed to bounce around the hall like the walls were hollow. When I finally got out of bed and opened the door, the hallway stood empty, stretching in both directions. The soft glow of the nightlight barely reached the ends of it. I checked the closest room, a guest bedroom, and found nothing. When I stepped back into the hall, the knocking started again, this time behind me, somewhere near the bathroom. I turned so fast my vision blurred, but again nothing was there. Just the sound, following me, moving through the house like it had its own intentions. I didn't sleep much after that. Rest didn't come easy in a house that made noise like it was thinking. The second night, the knocking started earlier. I was in the living room scrolling through my phone when I heard it again. 3 soft taps, almost gentle. I called out, asking if someone was there, but the house swallowed my voice. The knocking answered from down the hall. I walked slowly, checking each room, opening closets, pushing doors with my foot like I expected someone, or something, to push back. The rooms were always empty. What made it worse was that the knocking never came from the same place twice. It drifted through the house, always just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint it. Sometimes it came from the laundry room, faint and muffled. Sometimes from the coat closet by the front door. Once it came from the other side of the bathroom mirror, sounding almost like it was behind the wall. I called the host the next morning, explaining everything as calmly as I could. He laughed in that polite, uncomfortable way people do when they think you're overreacting. He insisted the house had no history of strange events. "You're probably just hearing temperature shifts," he said. "Those old houses expand at night." But I knew the difference between a house settling and a knock meant for me. This wasn't random. It was intentional. The longer I stayed, the more certain I became. By the 3rd night, I didn't bother checking the rooms anymore. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the knocking traveled through the house like footsteps trailing behind an invisible person. Sometimes it came from right outside my bedroom door. Soft tapping, waiting. Other times, it drifted down the hallway, moving from door to door in a slow, deliberate rhythm. A few times, it even stopped directly behind my headboard. I could feel the vibration through the wall, each knock sending a small shiver through the wood. Around 2 a.m., the knocking stopped altogether. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Heavy and expectant, like the house was holding its breath. I told myself that maybe whatever was causing it had finally stopped. Maybe it had lost interest. But then something new happened. The sound changed. It wasn't knocking anymore. It was weight. Pressure. Like someone leaning against the other side of the bedroom door. The hinges creaked softly. The air felt tighter, thicker, as if the space between the door and the hallway had been filled by something that wasn't supposed to be there. I stared at the door, waiting for it to turn, to open, to reveal something I wasn't ready to see. The handle never moved. But I could hear it breathing. Slow. Quiet. Drawn out like someone was pressing their face right against the wood. I didn't move for hours. The next morning, when I finally opened the door, no one was there. The hallway looked exactly as it had before. Empty, sunlit, innocent. But the space felt used. Disturbed. Like someone had stood there all night. The 4th night was the worst. I spent the day trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I even drove into town and stayed out until dusk, sitting in a coffee shop long after my drink had gone cold. But dread settled into my chest as soon as I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same, but something about it felt different now. Like whatever lived in the quiet knew me. Recognized me. Expected me. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quick enough to outrun the fear. It didn't. The knocking returned just after midnight. Louder now, less patient. I pulled the covers up to my chin, listening as it moved from room to room. But this time it seemed more deliberate. It wasn't just knocking randomly anymore. It was following a pattern. Bedroom door. Closet door. Wall. Then the floor beneath my bed. Each knock grew deeper, more resonant, as if whoever or whatever was knocking had grown bolder. Stronger. I pressed my palms over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound traveled through the mattress, up the frame, into my chest. It felt like it was knocking on me. I whispered for it to stop. I didn't expect a response. But the knocking stopped immediately. The silence returned. Heavy, suffocating, thick with awareness. I could feel eyes on me from somewhere inside the room, though I couldn't see anything in the darkness. My heartbeat was the only sound. Every instinct in me screamed not to move, not to breathe too loudly, not to acknowledge what else might be there. Minutes passed. Or hours. Hard to say. Then, from just inches behind my headboard, something tapped once. A single knock. As if answering. I left before sunrise. I didn't pack. I didn't check out. I drove until the mountains were far behind me and the woods no longer pressed against the road like they were leaning in to listen. The host called me later asking why I left without notice. I didn't answer. I knew he wouldn't believe me if I told him the truth. The knocking didn't follow me home. Not physically. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and the world feels thin, I'll hear something soft tapping in the walls. Just once. A reminder. Like something learned the sound of me standing on the other side of a door, and it's still waiting. I didn't notice the guest book at first. It sat in the corner of the living room, faded leather cover, edges frayed from years of handling. The host had mentioned it almost casually when showing me around, like it was a charming relic. Some guests like to leave notes, he said, smiling. I think it's fun to read what they remember. I thought nothing of it, placing my bag on the couch and moving toward the kitchen to grab a glass of water. But later that night, curiosity nudged me back to the living room. The house was quiet. So quiet I could hear the faint groan of the floorboards and the distant whistle of wind through the trees outside. I sat on the couch, lifted the book from the table and flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with ordinary entries. Dates, names, compliments about the house or the view of the mountains. I skimmed, amused at the mundane memories of strangers. Then I paused, my fingers hovering over a page dated the previous week. Someone had written about a song that had been stuck in my head that very morning. A tune I hadn't told anyone about, humming softly in the shower, a melody that had looped for hours without my realizing it. My breath caught. I thought I had misread, or maybe the universe had just been kind enough to mimic my thoughts. But the next line mentioned my favorite color, the one I hadn't thought about out loud in years. I closed the book quickly, a chill creeping up my spine. That night, I woke to a soft rustle. I remembered the guest book and, despite my unease, flipped it open again. The handwriting had changed. The neat cursive of earlier entries had become jagged, urgent, almost frantic. The words seemed alive, impatient, leaning across the page. And there it was, an entry that made my stomach drop. It described me standing at the window exactly as I did at that moment, back to the room, staring at the faint outline of trees in the darkness. I froze, my pulse hammering. The page went on to describe the angle of my head, the way my hands rested against the sill. Everything about it was wrong and impossible. I wanted to close the book, throw it across the room, destroy it. But my hands couldn't move. It felt like the house itself had tightened around me, holding my attention where it wanted. The words seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing with me. Every line felt like an instruction, a recording of me, a catalog of my presence. I flipped a few more pages, and the entries grew stranger. They predicted where I would go next in the house. Kitchen, hallway, bathroom, and even described thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of wind through the cracked windows, felt like a response. The house wasn't haunted in any ordinary sense. It wasn't just echoes of the past or shadows of former residents. It was aware, watching, recording, learning, and the guest book was the evidence. Each night, it seemed to grow more insistent, more accurate, more alive. By the third night, I stopped touching the book. I left it on the table, closed, as if ignoring it might prevent it from noticing me. But I could feel its presence, felt the weight of something observing, waiting. Every time I moved through the living room, I caught myself glancing at it. Every time I passed the table, the air felt heavier, as though the pages were turning on their own, impatient to document the next movement. On the fourth night, I couldn't resist. I opened it again, trembling, and the page was blank. I stared, confused. Then slowly letters began to form. Not cursive, not neat, scratched, jagged, trembling as if written by a hand that hated itself. It began to describe me, what I was wearing, the way my hair fell, even the faint tremor in my hands. Then it went further, predicting my next steps, my next thoughts. And I realized with horror that it might not be limited to observation. It was shaping the house around me, anticipating my movements, cataloging every small detail as if preparing for something I couldn't comprehend. I tried leaving the room, the house, even the town. But every time I glanced back at the living room, the guest book seemed to beckon, its presence heavy, almost tangible. I started to wonder if staying another night would make it worse. If I dared linger, would the next entry contain my name, written in my own hand, or worse, written in something permanent and unchangeable? Blood, perhaps, I thought darkly, because that was the only thing that could capture a presence so fully, so completely. I left the house the next morning without looking back. The guest book stayed, waiting on the table, silent now but not gone. And even now, months later, I feel its attention, a lingering sense that somewhere, something remembers me, catalogs me, watches for me in ways that no ordinary house ever could. The thought haunts me more than anything I saw in that town. I know I wasn't imagining it. The house wasn't haunted, it was alive, aware, recording. And I am left with the certainty that the guest book still waits, and that the next page might hold me if I ever return. The first time I noticed it, the hallway seemed longer than it should have been. When I arrived at the Airbnb, I had wandered through the living room and into the hall simply to stretch my legs after the drive. It was narrow, lined with doors on either side, and ended in a window that overlooked the trees behind the house. Nothing unusual. Just an old mountain home, with creaking floors and thin walls. But by the second night, I swore the hallway had stretched an extra few feet. The end window looked further away, and the space between the doors felt off, too wide, like the house had subtly expanded while I slept. It started with little things. I'd walk past a door that I was certain had been closed, only to find it ajar the next time I passed, leading into a room darker than the rest of the house. One night, curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed it open. The room inside was empty, but the far wall led not to another room as expected, but to a narrow passage I hadn't seen before. My pulse quickened as I realized that each doorway seemed to lead somewhere new, a subtle reshuffling of space that shouldn't have been possible. I backed out and shut the door quickly, convincing myself I was imagining it. By the third night, the hallway had become unbearable. I woke in the darkness to that familiar feeling of wrongness, the stretch of the floor under my feet, the way shadows pooled and lengthened in ways that defied logic. Every door I passed opened to empty rooms or new hallways, twisting and branching in directions I hadn't noticed before. I paced, searching for the exit, but no matter how far I went, the hallway seemed endless. Floorboards groaned under my weight, but sometimes I swore they creaked even when I paused. The walls whispered in the settling house's voice, murmuring just beyond my understanding. I tried to mark my path, placing shoes or towels at each doorway, but by the time I looked back, the markers were gone, or misplaced, in positions that made no sense. It was as if the house was aware of me, shifting subtly, rearranging itself while I slept, trapping me inside a geometry I couldn't comprehend. Panic set in. I ran, turning corner after corner, heart hammering, breath uneven. The shadows stretched impossibly long, reaching for me, curling along the walls and the floors, hiding corners I hadn't seen before. At one point, I thought I recognized a door at the end of the hall. Relief flooded me, but when I reached it, the handle wouldn't turn. I leaned against it, pressed my ear to the wood, listening to the faint sound of wind outside. Or was it just the house breathing? A soft groan traveled along the floorboards, and for a brief moment I considered sitting down, waiting for morning, hoping the geometry would resolve itself. But fear wouldn't let me stop. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled blindly through another doorway and into the cold night air. The mountains were dark silhouettes against the sky, the air sharp and scented with pine. I looked back to see the front door slam shut behind me, hard and final. No one was there. Nothing had touched it. My hands shook as I approached my car, the crunch of gravel under my boots grounding me, though the house still felt alive in my memory. Its endless hallways, its shifting rooms, the shadows that had watched me pace. I didn't go back inside. I didn't even try the windows. The hallway had ended somewhere I couldn't follow, and the house had let me leave on its own terms. I've stayed in mountain homes before, quiet ones that groan and creak as the night stretches on, but none of them moved like that. None of them toyed with the edges of perception until reality itself felt unreliable. I keep thinking about the endless hallway, how the walls seemed to stretch, how the house seemed to anticipate my every step. And I know deep down that I barely escaped. That place is still there, waiting, reshaping itself for the next person who enters its doors. The place looked harmless enough when I first arrived, a small, withered Airbnb tucked into the hills, the kind of property where the listing photos always look a little nicer than reality but still feel inviting in that Appalachian, backwoods kind of way. The porch sagged slightly to one side, and the steps groaned under my weight as I carried my bags in. The floors inside weren't much better. Every board creaked, even when I stood still, settling and shifting under the pressure of years, maybe decades. I chalked it up to age and tried to ignore the way the sound echoed oddly in the narrow hallways. Old homes make old noises. Everyone knows that. But the first night after the mountain dark had swallowed the house whole, I heard something different. Voices. Or what I thought were voices. At first, it was just a faint murmur, so low I couldn't tell if it was real or just the house breathing through its seams. I had been lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, and for a moment I thought the sound was coming from the vent. Then I realized there were no vents. Just old wood and older dust. The murmurs drifted up from beneath the floorboards, rising and falling like a conversation happening in another room, except there was no basement, no crawlspace, and definitely no one down there. I lay still, the kind of stillness where even your breathing feels too loud. I listened, waiting for some pattern, words, footsteps, anything I could attach logic to. But the murmuring stayed just beyond clarity, brushing up against understanding but always slipping away. When I finally got the courage to swing my legs off the bed, the voices dropped instantly to a whisper, almost like they knew I was moving. Like they were listening to me as much as I was listening to them. The next morning, the house felt normal again. Warm sunlight cutting through the dusty windows and landing on the warped boards. I pressed my ear to the floor in the living room, half expecting to hear something, but the wood was silent. Still, something about that silence bothered me even more. It felt too deliberate, like whoever or whatever had been murmuring was choosing not to speak. By the second night, the voices were clearer. I could tell there were at least two of them, maybe more, and they weren't just murmuring anymore. They were talking. Not loud, not enough for me to pick apart the sentences, but enough for me to feel like I was intruding on something, eavesdropping on a private conversation through a thin wall. I tried to ignore it for as long as I could, burying my head under pillows, turning the TV volume higher, even playing white noise on my phone. But the voices only adjusted, growing sharper, clearer, almost as if they were trying to speak over the distraction. I snapped at one point, yelling, "Stop!" into the empty room. The second the word left my mouth, the house went dead silent. My own voice sounded foreign in the stillness, swallowed by the wood. I didn't breathe for a moment, waiting for something to happen. And then, slowly, so slowly I thought I might be imagining it, the murmuring returned. But louder, closer, and for the first time it felt directed at me. The floor creaked under my feet as I knelt down, sliding my fingers along the edges of one of the boards. I shouldn't have tried to lift it. I knew that even as I did it. Old houses hide mold, bugs, maybe even loose wiring. But I had to know. My nails splintered against the rough wood as I dug underneath it, prying upward until the board snapped free. I expected dirt or at least a thin space, something physical and logical that would reassure me of reality. Instead, I found nothing. No crawl space. No insulation. Just a void, pure darkness that swallowed the beam of my phone flashlight. The voices surged up from that darkness like a gust of cold air, angling around me, filling the room, sharper than they had ever been before. I scrambled backward, the board clattering against the others as I pushed it away. My breath hitched as the murmuring rose into something like laughter or crying or both at once. They responded to my movements. They responded to my breathing. When I whispered, "What are you?" the voices fell silent, only to answer with a single soft whisper rising up from the void beneath the floor. I didn't understand the word, but I felt it. Like someone speaking directly into my skull, brushing against a part of me I didn't know could hear. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the voices shifting beneath me, murmuring, scraping lightly against the underbelly of the floorboards like they were trying to find their way up. I sat in the corner of the room with my back against the wall, watching the floor move subtly with every whisper. I told myself it was the house settling, but deep down I knew the house had settled centuries ago. This was something else, something that had learned the shape of my footsteps, the cadence of my breath. By the third night, the voices weren't beneath the floor anymore. They were inside my head. Not hallucinations, not dreams. I could distinguish my own thoughts from theirs, but barely. Every time I moved, I heard them shift with me, a chorus of low whispers threading through my consciousness, urging me to leave, warning me, begging me, mocking me. Their tones layered over one another until I couldn't tell if they were frightened or amused. One voice, a distinctly male one, whispered something that chilled me to my bones, a phrase I had said earlier that day while rehearsing an email draft. A phrase I had spoken only once, under my breath, alone in the kitchen. That was the moment I realized they weren't just echoing through the wood. They were echoing inside me. I tried to pack. Every zipper felt like thunder, every step like a shout. The voices rose and fell with my frantic movements, almost agitated, almost disappointed. When I reached the door, my hand hovering over the knob, the murmuring grew so loud I thought my skull might crack. They weren't stopping me, but they weren't letting me go cleanly either. I felt them curling behind my thoughts, sitting heavy in the space between panic and instinct. When I finally stepped outside, the night air hit me like cold water, crisp and unfamiliar. The house loomed behind me, quiet. Too quiet. I took one step toward my car, and the voices slipped away as if a line had been severed. My mind snapped back into place with a dizzy, nauseating emptiness. I don't remember driving away. I don't remember anything until I was miles down the mountain road, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only real thing left in the world. Even now, sometimes, late at night when everything else is silent, I hear the faintest murmur in the back of my skull, like someone speaking through floorboards that aren't there. And I wonder if those voices ever left the house at all, or if they just learned how to follow me. The Airbnb looked normal enough when I first unlocked the door, a quiet mountain rental tucked far back in the Appalachians, the kind of place people pick when they want to disconnect without admitting they're running from something. I wasn't running, not exactly, but I needed space. Time away from people, noise, and the relentless weight of everything I carried. So I booked a cabin with good reviews, a decent price, and a view of the tree lane that I thought would help clear my head. The first day went exactly how I hoped. Silence, clean wooden floors, a faint smell of cedar, and a soft breeze threading through the trees outside. I remember feeling relieved, like maybe for once I had picked the right place. But even then, before anything strange actually happened, something felt off. Not enough to concern me, just enough to remind me I wasn't completely alone. It started with the shadows. Not in an obvious way, not at first. Just little things. Slivers of darkness lingering on the wall when I passed, or a shape that seemed to stretch slightly longer than my own. I ignored it. My mind had been cluttered for months. I was used to feeling watched by thoughts I couldn't escape. But shadows? No. That was nothing. Or so I told myself. It wasn't until the second evening that I noticed how wrong it really was. The sun had set behind the ridge, leaving the house dim and cool. I flicked on the living room lamp and saw my own shadow fall across the floor. Nothing unusual. But beside it, on the far wall, another shape rested. Not mine, not anything in the room. A tall, thin silhouette like someone standing behind me even though the space was empty. I blinked. The shadow stayed. When I stepped forward, mine stretched and shifted like normal. The other one didn't move. It didn't even flicker. I told myself it was a smudge on the wall. A trick of the light. Something explainable. So I walked over to inspect it, leaning in close enough to see the tiny grooves in the painted wood. The closer I got, the colder the air felt, like standing in a draft even though no windows were open. And the shadow, that tall and narrow smear of darkness, stayed perfectly still even as I stood inches away. I reached out to touch it. I don't know why. Curiosity, stupidity, maybe the growing sense that something would change if I just made contact. But as soon as my hand neared the wall, the shadow shifted, not fading, not flickering, but pulling back slightly as if it were avoiding me. I jerked my hand away, stumbling backward until my calf caught the edge of the couch. That sudden, cold realization washed over me. It wasn't my imagination. Something else was in that room. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the faintest pressure at the edges of the room, the subtle stretch of darkness that didn't quite match the stillness of the house. The next morning I convinced myself that daylight would fix everything. Light always makes the world feel safer, grounded, real. So I pushed open the curtains and let the sun spill into the room. My shadow responded immediately, soft and warm against the floorboards. The other one was gone. Completely gone. I breathed easier. Told myself it had been exhaustion. Shadows can warp when you're stressed. Your mind fills in gaps. You see things that aren't really there. But that illusion of safety shattered that night. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, the light humming faintly overhead, when something caught the corner of my eye. A flicker in the mirror. At first I thought it was just my own reflection moving, maybe the tilt of my head or the sway of my hand. But the flicker stayed in the corner. Stayed too long. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth, and slowly turned my eyes toward the reflection. Behind me, near the doorway, was the same tall shadow I'd seen in the living room. No features. No movement. Just a dark human-shaped silhouette standing where the wall should have been blank. I spun around, but the doorway was empty. Only the cool, tiled silence of the bathroom greeted me. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow hadn't returned to its place. Instead, it had moved closer in the reflection, only a foot or two behind where I stood. That was when the toothbrush fell out of my hand. That was when I felt it for the first time, the pressure of presence. A cold line traced across my back, like someone walking their fingers along my spine. I backed out of the bathroom so fast my heel slammed into the hallway wall. The rest of the night, I left every light on in the house. Even then, I could see the dark shape lingering in my peripheral vision, always at the edge, always too close to fully ignore. By the third night, it wasn't hiding anymore. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to watch a movie, every muscle in my body taut with tension. At some point, the air in the room seemed to thicken. You know that feeling when someone stands too close behind you? When their presence changes the weight of the space around you. That's what it felt like. Except I was alone. Or supposed to be. I turned slowly, heart hammering as the hair on my arms stood up. And there it was. The shadow stepped out of the wall, actually stepped, its edges peeling away from the flat surface like someone detaching a sticker. It rose, unfolded, took shape in 3 dimensions, but still had no features. Just a void molded into the shape of a person. I don't know how long it stood there. Seconds, minutes. Time didn't feel real anymore. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body locked up, trapped in a silent standoff with something that shouldn't have existed. Then, as quietly as it had emerged, the figure shifted its weight, impossibly smooth like smoke learning how to imitate a person, and took one slow step toward me. I bolted. It wasn't graceful. I don't remember grabbing my keys or shoes or even my bag. I just remember running, out the door, down the steps, into the night air sharp enough to scrape my lungs. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I spent the night in my car at the bottom of the hill, too terrified to move, too afraid the thing had followed me. Every sound in the woods felt like footsteps. Every passing shadow from the trees looked like it was stretching toward my windows. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to go back for my belongings. The cabin looked normal again, quiet, still, almost welcoming. But when I stepped inside, I knew I'd made a mistake. My shadow moved with me, but another one lingered along the far wall, stretched unnaturally thin and patient, watching. Even as I grabbed my things and ran back out the door, it stayed perfectly still. Almost like it didn't need to follow me physically. Almost like it already had. I checked out that morning, handed the key back, and left without explaining anything. But the drive home felt wrong. Every reflective surface, rearview mirror, windshield glare, passing road signs, showed something faint trailing me in the corner of my vision. A dark, slender smear of shadow that stayed just long enough for me to notice. And even now, weeks later, I still see it sometimes. When I turn too quickly. When I stand in a dim room. When I let my guard down for even a second. It waits. It lingers. It stays longer than it should. And I think somewhere along the way, it decided that the house wasn't what it wanted. It wanted me.